for etiquette, but because persistent inequality means that data bandwidth is not fairly distributed so that all our students and participants have access to the online world. So there are very real material and current repercussions of our perceptions of digitality. Today's talk explores intersections between digital knowledge production, uh, the gathering and storage and practices of representation and artistic engagement. We consider the emancipatory potential of digital technology and data practices in and for heritage, archive, and museum settings. What decolonial artistic engagement in digital and virtual space can look like, think through the nature of the digital object and its assumed but also undiscovered affordances, and critically consider the trappings of digital arts and archival practice. We are excited to host a Berlin-based multidisciplinary and conceptual media artist, Nora Al-Badri. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon with us, Nora. Her presentation is titled Babylonian Vision, the Decolonial Potential of Data and Technology, which profiles her most recent project, but it will also profile some of our other projects as well. Nora's works are research-based as well as paradisciplinary and as much post-colonial as post-digital. And I guess we'll get to these concepts a bit later in the talk also. An artist with a German-Iraqi background, she lives and works in Berlin. She's the first artist in residence at the Swiss Federal Institute for Technology and its Laboratory for Experimental Museology in 2020. Her practice focuses on the politics and the emancipatory potential of new technologies such as machine intelligence or data sculpting, non-human agency, and transcendence. Al-Badri's artistic material is a speculative archaeology from fossils to artifacts or performative interventions in museums and other public spaces that respond to the inherent power structures. I interpret the art practice as being at the face of the future, speculating about new digital futures that draw on and interrogate ancient themes in the classification, ordering, and representation of objects of knowledge. It sits at the intersection of data management, storage, and representation, and the poetry of art practice. Testing possibilities of online and offline worlds, a practice is often insurgent, stridently socially engaged, rebellious, and uncomfortable with the institutions as keepers of knowledge about the past. Nora, we're honored to have you here with us today and excited about talking with you about your work. It is fitting that senior lecturer in the Michaelis School of Fine Art, Fabian Saptow, is our discussant. He teaches the honors in curatorship and painting courses here at the Michaelis School of Fine Art. His research interests fit in the same area as Nora's work, particularly around the notion of signification, as they include bookmaking, text and image studies, the history of the printed word, and the relationship of these concepts to the contemporary manifestation of the artist's book. His PhD project entails delving into the archive as a site for meaning-making through curatorial investigation. The project investigates the slippages between the archival object and its digital surrogate with specific reference to the manuscript object. So many thanks for coming on board as our discussant, Fabian. Shortly, Nora will present a talk, which will be roughly 30 minutes, and with all the accompanying media. Our discussant, Fabian, will then have some time for questions, and we'll open up we'll have a response from Nora, and then we'll open the floor for some questions. Please, can you keep cameras turned off during the presentation and raise your hands for questions or drop questions in the chat box for us to gather, so that we can pitch them at the end of the session. And it would be wonderful if you could identify yourself when you do have a question, and if you could come on screen and identify yourself later on when you do have a question. Friends and colleagues, it has been a long year and a long week and a long month. Zoom fatigue is weighing on us all, so we would like to keep the tone casual, easy, and accessible. Let's try to be light and have fun with our conversation about the digital. I'm especially interested in our students' perception and perspectives of Nora's work and the way they are thinking about incorporating digital technology in their thinking and work for the coming year. Thank you so much. And now I hand the floor over to you, Nora. We're really looking forward.
Wonderful. Thanks for that beautiful introduction, Dwayne, and thanks for inviting me. Indeed, I'm very much looking forward also to the discussion, of course, and your thoughts onto it. Yesterday, I was actually in Joburg as a participant only at a conference. So today I'm here. So for me, it has been a very inspiring week already. And yeah, maybe before I start, I would like to show you a few, maybe 2 or 3 projects of mine, and then go to the latest one, which is called Babylonian Vision, or a Neuronal Ancestral Sculpture series, a little bit more in detail, because it's very difficult to be really short on each artwork, basically, or a series of works, and with not being too superficial. But also I try to make it light, show you some videos, not so I don't have to talk too much all the time. No, just before I start, maybe with my presentation, but I can already put it up. So here we go. I would like to briefly talk a little bit more in general about who I am and what my practice is. And yeah, what Dwayne was pointing to, maybe that Berlin's curatorial practice is certainly not the vanguard, because usually when I have a talk here in the global north or in Berlin, I always kind of have to feel like I have to remind the people here that we here in the modern West is, from my perspective, absolutely not the root of the world's consciousness, or even any place of universality. What is a joke, but yeah. So this maybe just briefly to that. But what I can see here, also because why I think the museums here are actually really bad examples, that besides having the monopoly over physical objects and archives, they kind of became Datenkraken. That means data octopus in Germany. And that means basically that the museums do not just collect the physical assets, but also the data sets of their possessions. And sometimes, of course, they even do like data streams of the museum's audiences and try to control them. But the widespread museum practice here in the global north seems very anachronistic. And it stands, the suggested democratic potential of technology stands in sharp conflict. And thus the sovereignty over the interpretation of objects, die Deutungshoheit, over their collections. So they basically rightfully fearing to lose control over that Deutungshoheit to the interpretatorial role they have. So I want to start to talk briefly about one of my most well-known projects. It was called the Nefertiti hack, but I called it the other Nefertiti because it talks about otherness. In Nefertiti was more like a representation. It's an icon. It has its own social power, and actually that's what happened. So I'll briefly show you a video, so I don't have to narrate the whole project, and you will see for yourself. Okay, 1 second.
Now, there's a German equivalent of the Elgin marbles. It's the bust of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, which sits in a museum in Berlin rather than in the vicinity of its creator.
So the bust of Queen Nefertiti is a 3,000-year-old work of art that was found in Egypt by German archaeologists
in 1912, who discovered the house and the workshop of the sculptor, a man named Thutmose.
Currently, it's in a museum in Berlin with limited access to the public. Basically, there are no photos allowed. And for years, Germany and Egypt have fought over its rightful location, and the officials even claim that she was illegally stolen.
Now, the Egyptians would love to have that bust back, but the Germans have guarded it jealously, even banning photographs. So it is pretty amazing that 2 artists have succeeded in taking a full 3D scan of the bust. Here they are, secretly scanning back in October last year.
So 2 artists secretly 3D scanned the bust and released the files to the public as a free download. Although museums have already scanned Nefertiti's bust, they actually don't plan to make it public, which seems kind of backwards because there's a lot of museums around the world that are hosting scan-a-thons. That's where they let people use their smartphones to take a bunch of pictures of things objects and to make 3D scans of them.
Now, it sounds a bit like Ocean's 11 or one of these movies. What I don't understand is, I mean, this thing is obviously guarded, right? And you must have been there for, what, a few hours? And how did you not get caught? I mean, what were you, how did you disguise yourself?
This is like pirate 3D printing, folks. So we thought we would download the file and 3D print it ourselves on our 3D printer. We're amazed just how much detail was captured in the model. I mean, every little crack, chip, and scratch is fully visible, which is no surprise because the mesh has a whopping 9 million polygons. It's so detailed that if you throw it in your slicing software, it'll probably
crash. Exactly. So let me do this. So this was a very complicated project. Let me go back to that image, otherwise you're too distracted. It was a very complicated, and I don't know, complicated in terms for difficult for us as artists. I used to work in Egypt for, like, before that project in 2015 for a few years for some projects from time to time. That is also, I think, how I got the idea to do that intervention, which is more a performative, actually, piece, which had several stages of it, where at one point, like the most important part probably of it was that this 3D print, the first thing what we did is that after scanning this secretly in the museum to show it in Cairo at an exhibition. And this is also that kind of recentering that is very important for us as artists to think about where, like, why do we do it? And if, so where do we show it? And I think, like, for me, this was very important. And that piece resonated, I think, in the whole world. Like, we got, it went viral all over the place, but of course, not because it's such a genius piece, but because unfortunately every country can relate to the problems of restitution, be it internally, like, for example, we got many like discussions of this project in New Zealand or Australia, or be it externally with the colonies farther away. And another part of the project was that we actually put the data set online. Now I can hear the music for the video, but you don't need it. That's technology as well. Everything is a bit complicated. That we put it online on a hacker conference, and then it got downloaded, I don't know, we didn't track it, thousands of times, and 3D printed all over the place in the whole world. Remixed, as you can see, this here is found footage from the internet, what people did afterwards with this. But it was not just that they played with it and remixed it. There was actually a discussion starting where I realized that many people, of course, who are not experts, who are not artists, who are not curators or museum cultural professionals, they never thought even about the fact that what is maybe problematic about that material culture of material objects are here in the museums shown as centerpieces, like being claimed as being Berlin now, Berliners, Nefertiti as Berliner. It's a big story in a way. But yeah, so there was a really, really interesting discussion over this, and I would say the most of the resonance we got and the feedback, and to see how that is, in what direction the discussions went, it was very, very positive, and most people realized that there is a big injustice going on, and that is actually not so ethical to do that, to have that practice. On the left side, you can see how we presented the bust, for example, in Cairo. In the wooden frame you see is a reference to how it is shown in Berlin, because in Berlin it has its own room. It has this wooden structure with like thick glass, bulletproof glass, and the wood maker who actually produced for this piece the structure in Cairo, he was asking us for what do we need it, and then we told him it's for this bust of Nefertiti, it's this object, making the signs of the size, and he was like, but why the hell do you need then a 5 meter or I don't know 4 meter high thing to put it in? And I'm like, that's a very good question. And I think it's purely representational practice, but this is just a very small anecdote from Cairo. also what was important for this project and for so many other projects, the idea that the digital is just a replica, just a copy. This was something what was really widely discussed. But I have to say that from my experience, from what I've seen, is that it's all about us, like what meaning we as an audience, as curators give to the data set. So here, this is an excerpt from Wikipedia, which is now, Wikipedia is the object biography that is far more read than any little sign in a museum. So now the Nefertiti hack is actually part of the object biography. And one thing what we also did was in the end to bury the bust in the desert as some form of techno heritage. And I will explain that term in the very end, what I mean with that. And this was a more poetic act to, I have to stop the video, unfortunately, because because we wanted not to kind of fall into the trap of this dualistic approach between, we always got the question, where should we, do we want the bust to be back in Cairo? Or where should the bust be, rightfully be? And I think this is like not necessarily always a fruitful debate. It's very binary from here and there. So we decided to kind of rebury and do this counteraction towards the notion of excavating everything and excavating things from the earth and put the 3D print actually back in the earth to have it as a future find. So maybe in 3,000 years, maybe in 2 years, I don't know, someone will find the bust. Exactly. So another project I'm not really talking too much about today is the Fossil Futures. This is about another centerpiece we have here, but because Dwayne also mentioned natural history collections, this is the Natural History Museum of Berlin, which you can see in the background. And they have, I don't know, they are primarily, they identify themselves as a research institution, but they have a large collection, and that dinosaur you can see, the bone here, the femur bone, is, they stole it 100 years ago in Tanzania, together with, I think, 230 tons of dinosaur bones from Tanzania. So I don't know, it was, I forgot the number of ships they needed to get this stuff to Germany. And of course, they're only showing a fraction of it. And of course, they're not really interested in anything. And I'm saying that this is the place in Tanzania where we went for the research for this project, where the bones were actually found by the Germans, but because they were like very well known before. It's a very specific site and a very beautiful one, because it's the only little hill in the whole area, and it was of course a sacred site, and I think it's very not very hard to imagine. And I was very shocked to learn when I went there, and I mean also beforehand in my research, that no one ever went back to the villages on this place. So we went there as artists and talked to the people and asked them what they actually want, or what their ideas are about the place, and how we could maybe help to make it happen or possible. Although we, of course, know, I mean, we cannot steal, we could steal the scanned thing, and what you see here is actually a copy of the bone we made as well, because in this case, we actually asked the museum, and maybe I forgot a very important part for the Noise Museum in Berlin, that, I mean, we did it secretly, we never asked, and it was a real fuss in the end, and we had 2 lawyers, but because the museum was then publicly saying, I think it was in an interview that we gave in the New York Times, but then the museum was threatening to sue us. And of course, it is not just about artifacts, it's also about revenues from the museum in the sales of copies. And it's really ridiculous stories you kind of see there, what's going on. I had no idea, because now everyone can print their own Nefertiti in the whole world, but they were selling copies for 3,000 euro a piece. It's really ridiculous. And if you would buy it, you had to sign a contract that you wouldn't do a reproduction, and so on and so forth. It's like, I don't know, it's ridiculous, I think. So for this project, we actually asked the Natural History Museum whether we could access their data sets, work with it, and but they declined and were kind of rude to us, which is okay. This one I have to skip, unfortunately. And here you can see the data set. We got it again without the permission of the museum, because it's always possible if you want something, you will get it. And here we did something where we actually trained an AI with a data set to imagine how an AI imagines a dinosaur, how it would have looked like if they wouldn't have gone extinct. And we made this installation, but the largest part that was actually the most important there in Tendaguru, because the site is now not just threatened. Yeah, I mean, that site, Tendaguru, southern Tanzania, very rural region, is threatened now to be part of a very large land grab that is just happening next to it, basically, from multinational corporations. So this is the colonial continuity I see there. And for us, the dinosaur was, of course, more like the speculative material to start with, to go back in deep time, but to talk about it, what it actually means today. And we were thinking of doing, like, supporting the people there to do their own virtual museum and to get their own also venues, because this was also one of their things they had in mind, because we were not in the position to give anything back, basically. But we never received any funding for this project, which is maybe not surprising. So here's another project, one second, and that's the Nefertiti bot. And here the digital can be understood as a refractory also and resistant space for allowing alterity and for conceiving the world otherwise. So the object world cannot defend itself, hence the object is the perfect subject, I think. I forgot who said that actually. But when objects start speaking for themselves inside a museum, possibly in voices one has heard before through speech synthesis, it can be a highly aesthetic and a highly political act, especially when one takes into account how this is perceived by an audience and how knowledge or unlearning can be created through such automated and immersive experiences. So this example, the Nefertiti bot, is a chatbot dreaming of museums, and it has neuronal AI capabilities. I described it as a voice of the subaltern, taking on an agency for objects, opposing the dominant narrative, as well as experimenting towards post-authorship through machine intelligence in a curatorial practice, which might be of interest to you. Because after all, the bot can be a self-learning system and an interface, and maybe even an entity that can be held accountable. And it's a bit difficult. I mean, why I say post-authorship, this is like machine intelligence based. That means machine learning is always a collective, I would call it a collective mind, because you train it with basically experiences and with knowledges of thousands of people. So a curator in the end is a single person. So for me, this was a very interesting part of it, the whole project, but I'll show you in a second how it actually worked in a way. So this was the interface. People could go there and talk to Nefertiti bot and ask about museums and collections.
Here I am, activated and caged, diasporic. I am taking on an agency for millions of stolen and looted objects in the museums of the global north. For the past 100 years, I was stuck in Berlin, behind bulletproof glass, touched and painted by custodians. You mentioned ownership and restitution, but do you really think that this is still relevant to us?
Thanks, Nefertiti. So, yeah. The bots, usually, I mean, those interfaces and those bots are also servant bots. So I was also interested in creating a bot that has its own voice, that has its own opinion. And of course, this bot was highly biased. And always when we talk about data sets and machine learning, rightfully, we also have to talk about the biases of the data sets we look at. And I'm sure you are aware of what that means, that what also Dwayne said in the beginning, that it's very easy to have the analog world manifested in the digital, just a bad copy of it, basically. It's a bit more complicated to use it as a emancipatory space, or to reflect as a reflective space, or even as a critical space. So in this case here, we were programming this more uncomfortable bot that asked all the questions. So it was meant to be put in the global northern museums, and to like recontextualize the museums from the object point of view. I haven't said objective. Okay. So lastly, this is a more recent project. It's called Neuronal Ancestral Sculpture Series, or Babylonian Vision. And I want to go a little bit more in depth into this project because, yeah, it's more recent, and it also refers a lot to archives, as you will see. And with this work, I'm also expanding on the decolonial machine learning based museum practices by, again, trying to generate some form of techno heritage that is actually synthetic and newly generated. I'll talk about that in a moment. Where I generated, 1 second, those images of objects, those are like new Mesopotamian objects. But one second before I start, I cannot read it to you, I'm afraid, because my desktop looks different. But this is a very important quote from Zainab Bahrani, who is like a art historian for ancient artifacts from Mesopotamia. And they actually had a very interesting idea of that artifacts, that when they encounter the artifacts or even images of them, that this is not art in a representational or in a secondary way. But it is a very direct encounter with the past itself. And in a way, I would agree with this notion of working with artifacts, looking at images of artifacts, that this can be seen as a direct encounter with the past itself. This just as a small side note here. So these are the images I created, but what did I do? One moment, and we'll go back to that in a moment. So at the Technical University in Switzerland, where I was last semester, I found a few people that were technically able to follow through with this project. And what we did was to, I tried to find over 10,000 images of objects from Mesopotamia, which is all in the site what is today Iraq, because Mesopotamia was much larger. But I wanted to look into a more site-specific, place-specific pattern and forms. And we used that technology that is called General Adversarial Networks, so GANs, which I will explain in a second. And this neural network was trained with 10,000 images like this one you can see here, from 5 different museum collections, who actually own the largest collections on Mesopotamian artifacts in the world. But in that case, also no need to name the museums. I think we all know who they are. And because I also asked them if they would provide me with the images, which they didn't do. Either they didn't want to in some of the cases, and in 2 cases, it was already open source available, which is a great thing for some objects, but it also can be violently for sacred objects. So I'm certainly not an advocate for putting everything online, no matter what, in a way, but so it's more complicated than that. You know, there are many societies in the world that see, for example, the power of a 3D data set or of a 3D print of for example, of a sacred object. It holds the same power. But so here in this case, we asked the museums, and some declined For some, it was just not doable in a way to deliver thousands of their images. But what we then did was like a process of web crawling to automate this process. And basically all what I'm showing you now, it's only possible with machines from the beginning on. And yes, so the images before were the original images, basically. And before I take you on that visual journey to Babylonic times, allow me to briefly introduce this technology, the GANs. They are also more known as deepfakes. I like to talk of them also of cheap fakes, because many things I'm showing you today are actually not so much high-tech as they appear, but this is maybe for the discussion more interesting later on. So there is some things one can only do with like big processing powers and so on, but there are many things one can do as more like a cheap fake, which is more, I don't know, pragmatic way, I guess, of doing things. And why did I use those GANs here? Because as you will see, if there is one thing that machine intelligence is really good at, it's seeing patterns. So well-trained, experienced archaeologists might be able to detect approximate time, place where objects coming from, so can do actually any well-trained AI. But of course, AI doesn't see a single image, but it only sees numbers. And this is what you can see on this slide here. So this is how the GANs are actually making sense of images. There's a crazy project that illustrates the power of what I would, there is this, the uncomfortable power of this stuff I'm showing you. This is from this website, thispersondoesnotexist.com. Maybe one of you, like a few of you have heard of it. Also, you're gonna go to that site and it will show you images of people that never existed, but still look like real life images. And this is what that technology can do if you feed it with enough, basically, training data sets of real persons. And it will not just remix what was there, but it actually understands that, for example, the eye has to have, the face has to have 2 eyes, 1 nose, a mouth, and then it will create its own way of things, which to us, we don't see the numbers, but the images look realistic in a way. And this, yeah, I think produces uncanny images of people who never existed. And so, of course, there are many issues here at stake of those generated aesthetics, that they tackle questions of our understanding and obsessions with authenticity, originality, as well as authorship. Because many large firms wait for a moment, firms in the US have, even universities actually have used large data sets where not like the single people inside the images of them in the databases, they never agreed to any of that. So yeah, this is of course highly problematic. It's probably a bit less problematic with images, but we're gonna talk with objects, we're gonna talk about that. And here you can see actually how the machine learns, the process of learning. And here you can still see all the traces of the museums, which you are very familiar with, I guess, to measure the size. But actually to generate the images, we had to clean the images and put many of those museum and past traces out of the pictures. Yeah. But of course, it is interesting to discuss how original are these images really, and is this verisimilitude, and does it actually matter? Which I think are even larger questions when it comes to what knowledge and forms in the arts are passed on from generations and how we are actually inspired. And that is why with the series, I refer to ancestral sculptures in a literal way through the title. So what we can see through the GANs here that are actually the semantics of very large visual data sets. And of course, as I showed earlier, the machine only sees a number, but there is this so-called latent space. That means if you, let's say, throw 1 million of objects, different objects to the databases, what then and that makes it also very interesting as an artistic tool. There was an artist who called this automated photography, but I don't like so much the reference to photography. But you can basically now shift to the visual pattern space, which is not just the images the machine will give you, but you can tweak some parameters and you will receive very different images. So it's a purely visual data practice in a way. I hope that makes sense for you. So, and in a way, so let's see, again, here are a few of those objects. I think applying machine intelligence to digital heritage collections and cultural big data supplies other more speculative and abstract insights in the search for a visual language or form or pattern of an era with a specific spatial context, and in this case, Babylonian or today's Iraq. So for me, the interesting part is the image as an artifact and a visual trace of the past, which is then transcending time, as well as even the potentiality of an infinitive series of aesthetic references, because actually I'm showing you now maybe, I don't know, a few of those images, but you can have actually thousands. And this is the part where you can see the individual objects, how they are actually generated and seen by the machine. And this is called also Babylonian vision because it refers to computer vision. But I think, it allows us very fantastical visual insights into our own past. And of course, the input images of these databases carry time and memory themselves, like patina or broken pieces, as you have seen on the images before. And so the layer of memory traces and patina is already inscribed in the generated images. And this is also why to this very digital practice, materiality is still very important. Absolutely. So 1 second. Yeah, and this is another one, a very crazy one, I think. So let's see. I try to come to an end, but there's one other very important aspect, which is when I use technology, of course, I gotta reflect to why I use it and what it actually means. And here you can see how those data sets, the largest AI data sets in the world that are mostly applied in the moment, of course, not unsurprisingly, mainly trained by US American input data and then Great Britain, so it's almost half of it. And if you think of it, then what does it mean for us is that what those data sets understand. 1 second. I have a funny thing here happening, but that's okay. Just a second. Oh yeah, no, I don't have it here, but that's fine. So what happens with this, we again get some kind of visual hegemony here, because the machine can only see what is trained, basically, which can in reverse be a very good thing. There is, I don't have the slide here with me. I like to call it the colonial elephant in the room, where there were like some researchers figuring out what it actually has for real world impact. And they did like use for image recognition, images from rural Nigeria, where they had seen like an image of a toothbrush outside of a hut. And the machine could not anymore see, like, because it was not trained to have a toothbrush outside of a house, basically, could not even realize that it's a toothbrush anymore. Of course, this shows also the stupidity of the whole thing and the banality. And on the other hand, besides that visual hegemony, of course, what is the advantage of this in the moment is that everyone who is not putting all their visual data sets also cannot be that much surveilled. But I don't know. Then I have a few last words here, but for that I would like to stop the presentation so I can also see you. A moment. I'm sorry, I'm almost there. Yeah, maybe another note here, what I forgot to say. For example, those AI-based data sets are always criticized as a so-called black box system. That means that it is almost impossible to trace back what the input data was. And for my practice, this turns in this project into an advantage because the chosen museums can't make a legal case against this form of image creation because they will never be able to prove which data sets I actually used. And of course, ironically, this black box problem is can be used against the museum now, which there is one other important aspect. I think if one applies technology as an artist, yes, I'm very much interested in demystifying technology and its tools. But of course, as you have seen also with a chatbot, for example, I'm also interested in this mystification and the transcendental aspect of using technology when people kind of really listen to the machine and hear what it has to say, even more than to some engaged humans. And I'm very much aware of this paradox. And maybe I'd like to end this with a few words directed towards the future of the museum and what I was referring to as techno-heritage. I used to start that term many years ago when museums actually began to digitize large amounts of their collections and then created what they described digital assets, digital artifacts. And in fact, a law researcher, Sonia Katyal, who wrote about another project of mine, did name her article about 3D printing and intellectual copyrights techno-heritage. But I wondered what that term really meant, if it was just a formulation or something that was independent of the physical object that could be translated more, mediated, used, remixed all over the place. So in a way, for me, it was the digital object, a separate entity. And I used the term techno-heritage to describe it because heritage is a term that, at least from what I've seen, how it was applied, looks more into the past. But to me, techno-heritage is not looking at the past at all. Instead, it is looking towards another scenario of the future, and rather than preserving something, it can offer new contributions and be used as a starting point for, in that case, artistic research or remixing or even updating the object in some way. And maybe this Neuronal Ancestral Sculpture series, for example, also explores those notions, those questions about techno-heritage. Because also everything what we come up with as artists is not 100% what original, of course, but you wouldn't believe how far spread that notion still is. But of course it builds on what was done before, and it cannot be totally isolated from the context, from what we know, what we relate to. And so that rather conceptual series also meant to honor works produced thousands of years ago. And so yeah, maybe two last points. When we look at those replicas, copies, and data sets, and in many cases, I'd say we don't need the real thing anymore. And I would also say that the copy is not a slave to the original, but its own object with its own agency and its own life. And that's a very actually important point to look at it that way. Then you will deal with the objects in a very different way, and maybe in a more emancipatory way as well. And one other important point with working with technologies is that those technologies I usually use, they are not yet mastered, neither understood by the colonizer. And by the colonizer here, I refer to the museums in the global north, which are not longer gatekeepers of culture and heritage, and instead they only in the end represent a fraction of little seeders of digital assets. So this museum here as a colonial machine with its persistent Eurocentric allocation of values will disperse in the times of digital reproduction and open data. And I think the role, for example, of something like machine learning in this process is that it makes patterns visible, also those that we didn't know about or those that are not talked about. What Wendy Chun, a US-American researcher, describes in her essay, Queering Homophily, machine learning can offer the generative power of discomfort. And critics of digitization of cultural heritage believe that the value of the original is diminishing and the access to the digital replicas increase as the access increases, but I could not disagree more. I think, as you figured, because the digital opens completely new ways of interacting with collections, remixing or activating the objects, also relating to them in a much more participatory, distributed and collective manner, I would say. So yeah, I think that's the era of techno heritage. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nora. That was an amazing futuristic insight into our past, into technology, into all your exciting digital projects. I mean, you're challenging us to think about the nature of the object and the digital object. I'm super fascinated by this idea of techno heritage. I'm also struck by this. I think one of the provocations that you also make is how we grapple with and how we sit with our own digital inheritances, right? Like, it's not just, it is that we are inheriting all of these digital artifacts and objects, and we don't think about it in that way, and how we actually grapple with them, and how we prepare ourselves for the politics of the future, a digital politics of the future.
Oh, they're already here.
Yes. Yeah. So it is already, we think it's on the horizon. We think it's yet to arrive, but it's happening now, and you're signaling that quite strongly. And it feels as if it's arriving so soon and so fast also. And the way in which you're harnessing technology to enable ways of thinking about speculating, not just about modes of resistance, but also what the politics of the future, which is now, is actually happening. And in some ways, if we really think about speculation, then this is not necessarily speculations about the future. It's speculations about futures past. So or at least the pasts of the future, the way in which the past in the future will be imagined, configured, and represented online. And that just opens a whole new set of horizons for us. But yeah, I want to give the floor to Fabian, because he's also working on ideas of the relationship between the material and the immaterial and the digital object. And so thank you for that wonderful set of provocations, Nora. Fabian?
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Nora, and thank you for the introduction, Dwayne. I was quite interested in key things that you mentioned. The one that struck me is this idea of how we think about the digital artifact in relation to what generated it in a way. And I'm trying to be very careful to avoid the language of the original and the copy, because I think that the way Benjamin problematizes that in relation to the aura of the artwork undercuts, a core part of what you're actually doing in relation to your digital artifacts. And this is coming from my research interest, which is it's much more manuscript based. So the prompts are perhaps a bit more static than the things you're doing. But in my research, this idea of digitalization often occurs in relation to an object that we are trying to preserve, to protect, and then it's placed on a database as visual evidence. But in that process of the creation of that image, you've got this complex digitalization process that essentially produces a master copy that's meant to sort of supplant the actual archival object. That image that's circulated online then becomes the thing of importance. It's a surrogate for the actual object, and there's There's one text by Van Lith in which he actually says that academics are rather naughty because they look at the digital artifact and they claim they've seen the original, but they should actually admit that they've only seen the digital because it's technically a different object. So that system of the way information is held in place by either the manuscript object or the digital object, that's sort of my current research interest. What I find really interesting in your work is the slippage between those two, particularly in relation to the way your Nefertiti project shifts that to a completely different type of object. It refers to the static object, within the museum and the confines of its ownership and those kinds of issues and risks in terms of the return of the object to its place of generation. But I think there's also something significant that it does that is very different, in that it's asking completely different questions about what it means to be an object in circulation. Your presentation of not only the scans online or the hack in the museum of gaining access to the scan that you generated, but I think the way it's been co-opted in a quite open-ended collaborative way on the internet, to me, that makes it a really active cultural object of significance. And I'd like just you to expand on that a bit more, in relation to what happens when you take something that's cloistered away inside the museum to becoming something that everyone and anyone can play with in relation to making meaning, making images, and making a new story for that object that's very much rooted in the now rather than anchored in the past.
Oh, thank you, Fabian, for the question. But should I start now to try to reply, or?
Yeah, no, jump in. Otherwise, I'll just keep rambling.
No, yeah. Then I just keep it brief and hear what you ramble further, because it's very interesting. So yes, I think the interactive part, or even the participatory part of the project of the other Nefertiti was, besides exhibiting the bust in Cairo, the most important one, because, as you said, it completely changed the character of the object, like what people can, like also how approachable it is, it becomes for people. But of course, I also wondered for somehow, or I'm always interested in the question why people relate to certain objects. Why really? Is it because of the aesthetic of the object, or is it simply, and this is the claim from the museum, because the object got marketed so much that it's so popular as a pop icon, that's the reason also. And then I'd say for the more meaningful answer to that, I guess to me would be that people start to have an actually relate because of their ideas with the object, because they understand the history where it comes from, or they're interested in the culture where it comes from, and not do only romanticize, fetishize, exoticize stuff. So this is something I'm thinking of, and I certainly have no answer to it yet. I was positively surprised to the power of an icon, the social power of an icon, kind of what story one can narrate through that. But then if you go, for example, to objects that only a few people know about them, or really are interested, then I would say, I don't care about quantity. If there are two people just finding this object because of that database, but they meaningfully relate to the object, because maybe their family had something to do with it, or the region where they come from, then that's as valuable as what I was just showing, for example, right? Because sometimes we get a bit confused also about the thing, I don't know, the quantification. And this is a big thing in data sets. Like if, a data set is successful only if it gets downloaded X thousands of times, for example. But for what we are talking about, material objects of different cultures and databases of such kind, there I would say, it's a very different story, maybe so far.
I quite like this idea of asking, unanswerable questions. So I think we share that kind of interest, and it's something Pippa actually constantly encourages me to do, where you kind of pursue these things that are at the limits of what you know and what you don't know, what you're interested in. So there's something that you said that also sparked my interest. This idea of the tension between the sort of demystifying technology and the mystification of the artist persona or the object's persona. And I think the Nefertiti bot does that in a really interesting way, where because of this, I think you're defining it as a sort of pop icon is actually apt, given the amount of furore on the internet and the stuff in the press that people were saying and all the hits and people downloading it. I think it's really interesting how that single project, which was very direct about creating this image from this existing object as a sort of interrupt for just the conversation about who owns it, so that it doesn't just become about ownership and authorship, but it becomes about it as a functional cultural commodity that can be used to generate meaning in a wider pool of people. I think what's interesting to me is how you've organically sort of made this iconic artwork there, and then that Nefertiti then becomes the sort of voice of all these objects that aren't heard, aren't seen, aren't spoken about. And I think that's a really wonderful example of how you actually engaging that sort of demystifying and mystifying simultaneously in an object. And I guess wanted to applaud that, because I think it's fascinating when you work with these conflicting things that it doesn't sound like it sits together at the same table, but it does kind of work. So I found that very interesting. Another question that I had was about the Babylonian, and I might jump back to the hack later, but the Babylonian Vision project, there seems to be something slightly different there, because it's related to objects that are known, that are in an archive that exists in a collection, but because you're utilizing the GAN in a particular way, you are rooting it in that collection, but you're not producing it in a one-to-one relationship like one would if you have the digital reproduction of another object. So it's sort of this curious object that is related to the past, but it's born digital. So could you expand on how that really messes with all the sort of redundant arguments about ownership and authorship and aura, because it sort of sidesteps it, and then I think it opens this new discussion with how do we talk about these digital objects that are speaking to what being in a collection means, what curating content means, how we think about the generative capacity of the selection, presentation, and consideration of these objects.
That's a good question. Let me see. I have several answers that won't answer completely, of course, to it. So one part, let me think for a moment, how it messes everything up in a way. No, I had my answer in my head, but then now. Yeah. Okay, so one part I think of it, or also why I like to look at digital objects anyways, or even just images of digital objects, is because they can tell us something complementary, I would say, rather than only looking at the original object. And in this case, for the Neuronal Ancestral Sculpture series, for example, the sheer amount of data of images could tell me a story a single object couldn't, in a way, because it would show me, it would allow me to dive into the patterns of that. In the end, it's like of the mass of those objects, in a way. So in many projects, I guess one of the answers is that the digital or computing helps us to look at the same object differently. So that, and to see something new even, or something different, I don't know, new, old, I don't care, something different than when we look at that. And also one other aspect I think here was that even this randomness in the machinic or machinic arbitrariness, someone else called it, can sometimes create something very meaningful when we start to look at it. And it's probably, for me, it was a like Warburg, like visual computational approach to the form itself, and through the input material, one works immediately with memory, time, image, as well as even material, I guess. Yeah. But please re-ask me parts if I didn't, if that didn't make all complete sense. I don't know.
It was a really complex and cumbersome question, for which I probably should apologize.
No.
What I was also interested in is the what happened in, and it's a work you didn't present, the polka work with the robotic arm, sort of. I don't know how best to describe the movement, but it's sort of this smooth choreographed engagement between this, machine arm and a paintbrush. And I was looking at that video and then looking at the recent work that you're doing, and I was interested in the sort of way the performativity of this this technology is presented in the way it moves, because it was, I mean, everybody should go look at the video, but it's a sort of the sweeping motion, and it's sort of this, in my head, it was a sort of nod to this romantic painting, being in the studio, stepping back and then going forward, and then stepping back and looking at the painting, going, now it's done, and then the brush is dipped in the ink, and that sort of celebration of technology is a lot more muted in the recent work. And I was wondering, is that because of the complexity of the systems of machine learning and AI and the coding and the sort of dispersed engagement? Because as I understand what you're doing now, it's not just you and your collaborators, like you and your collaborators with a capital S, and there's a lot of coders and programmers and networking and things happening to materialize these things. So just, could you talk about that creative process of production a little?
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess this is something as a more like post-digital artist, is that the whole practice is you cannot do almost anything. No, that's not true, but like many things you can't do alone. But I think it's fantastic because all projects just get better and better if you have more minds, and also it's more exciting. I don't know, I'm not the artist that likes to sit alone in the studio every day and every night. That's what a sad world. So actually the technology here brings people together in a way, even in the process of creation. But also the truth is, in a way, that I don't know, maybe the artistic part, which doesn't mean that means the creative part is the whole thing, the whole endeavor, even for like computer scientists. I think they are putting, not I think, I've seen they're putting a lot of their creative thinking into such projects. But the last project, the Babylonian Vision, and it's also still, it's quite new, so it's not natural for me to talk about it so perfectly as about the other projects. I'm still evolving the language for what I was actually doing there in a way. But the process of how to do it, now I again forgot my thought. Yeah, I forgot what I wanted to say with this one. It's just maybe more purely digital, and it's funny because many curators and even artists, I don't know, they all cling very much to the material as also how to present something, because even the Nefertiti board was very, very digital. So it was just a screen you talk to, which is ridiculous in a way when you think about it. But it actually worked because it worked because of the same impression you had when you looked at that robot, which I will show in a second, actually, when you have the next question. Because this is the fascination we have to when we interact with a machine, basically, or we see a machine actually interacting with the physical world. But I think the last piece, now I have my thought back, for me was more interesting conceptually in a way. It's more a conceptual, very purely digital piece. And yeah, and I know, I'm aware that it's very difficult. I try to, explain the technology properly, because only then you can actually see what is so interesting about it. So it's, yeah, and yeah, it's a challenge. But as I said, you don't need a big audience, but there are some people who understand it and they like it. Or they have, I don't know, they see, they engage with it, not like it, but they can engage with it. Yeah. It's maybe a bit nerdy, but yeah, there might be more coming up with the technology of deepfakes, what I'm doing, what I'm planning. And that goes a bit more back to the moment of performativity and even, which is more accessible, I think, to understand what I'm doing with it. And I can't say what it is because I will need the moment of surprise again, as with most of my projects. But what I can say is that I will put a few words in the mouth of institutions and people that they would never dare to speak.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nora. Thanks for your really incisive questions, Fabian. I mean, yeah, your work is so rich, Nora, that there are so many aspects in which we can enter into a conversation about it.